after 2 very intensive days, despite the intensive and very wide range of issues discussed by us, it will be presumptive for both of us here to try to sum it up. But I would like to suggest that we focus perhaps on 2 issues which appeared again and again and went through various aspects of our discussions. One is the issue of solidarity or the lack of it or alienation, which creates a political vacuum which enables populism and anti-democratic leadership to thrive. The other one has to do with the issue of the weakening of the mediating institutions of representative democracy, which leads us to the role of the social media. And we have all heard today a very extensive and fascinating discussion by Sheila Jasanoff. So perhaps I should really start by asking Sheila, where do we go from here? Now, is it possible to use the media which are available, but are now having a monopoly of power which is transnational and is able to really create new subjects rather than citizens? Is it able to use those media and those modalities to create new mediating institutions? And is it possible to create a system of checks and balances regarding to those new mammoths or juggernauts, if you wish, of the social media, which today more or less work without any external constraints. One of the paradoxes is that traditional political systems, democratic system, traditional economic entities, corporations, and certainly do work under certain legal constraints, which are still within the nation state, but are also now subject to international legislation through United Nations and other organizations. This does not apply, as we have seen, to the social media. So perhaps, Sheila, you can start with this.
Well, Shlomo, it's daunting that you think that I'm going to solve the problems of the social media in the last few minutes remaining to us of this session, and I'm in any case more interested in hearing what people in the audience may have to think. But just a few thoughts to set us going. One is that I'm struck at the degree of paralysis that the legal and constitutional imagination has been displaying with regard to the media. I mean, there's this sense that you have to regulate them and they're too powerful. There's very little attention to the fact that some of the other issues that we've been talking about, such as inequality, are closely tied up with the rise of the media. So, for instance, if every January, Oxfam or other companies, NGOs like that tell us that there are between 5 and 7 people who own half the wealth of the world, and that is a measure of inequality. And then you ask, well, who are these people? Many of them are tied to Silicon Valley or to fortunes that have been made via Silicon Valley. And then one has to ask, well, how did this happen? And of course there are analogies. People talk about the robber barons of the turn of the previous century, and there was a period when new resources that became freed up were allowed to be used with no sign of, rents being due to anybody for the sake of the use of these resources. So the data that we've given up are surely regulatable in certain ways, and yet we have colonized the minds of the people who are involved in social media to such an extent that they're not thinking about these questions. So I am teaching people who are by now a third of my age or something like that, and they have grown up in a different world. And we raise questions about privacy and so forth with them. I had an extraordinary experience in a class taught to half engineering and half humanities students a year ago. And there was a moment when we were talking about, well, what people think of giving up their data. And one of the responses that I can't forget was that a young woman blurted out in a very angry way, I don't have to look at advertisements for diapers. I don't want to look at ads for diapers. So this was her response. I mean, as if the only kind of right she could think of was the right to be free of ads that were not targeted to her. But for the sake of having ads that would be targeted to her, she was prepared to give up any information. And therefore, she was not prepared to think in terms of, you know, what are these things called personal data and what's going to happen to them? I mean, so that is the mindset of the very young that we, in a sense, have to deal with. So why can't we use law and the legal and the power of legal rethinking to reclassify things? I mean, we know that in the past we've done things like taken transportation companies and thought of them as utilities. I mean, you know, they mix up the categories. I mean, why are the categories not being mixed up in a certain sense? People have become generators of information. We sit there powerless and say there is a president who tweets and he has this kind of audience. But by the time somebody is reaching audiences of that size, should we not be rethinking the source of that information in a different way from just, oh, the First Amendment, and everybody's free to say whatever? People were never free to say whatever. In the first basic class in law school, we learned that people could not get up and shout fire in a crowded movie theater, right? I mean, so there are constraints on speech. So when we've opened up a way for a single person to reach that many people, plus it's instantaneous, plus we have terminology like Twitter storm, I mean, metaphors that bear attention, why are we not having centers that are really thinking through ownership of data, dissemination of data, speed of transmission, power of translation, and those things? It seems to me that I keep hearing the same somewhat fatalistic comments coming from all over the place, bound to a constitutional order that is just not flexible enough or dynamic enough to accommodate the new kinds of identities and possibilities that we've opened up. And for that, I think we need a different kind of collaboration. I think lawyers have to come out of their, you know, mindsets that I am an intellectual property lawyer, or I am a constitutional lawyer, or I am an international lawyer, and really think among themselves about their own categories. But I think we also need to reach our students and our publics in ways that jolt them out of this convenient mindset that if I want my diapers or don't want my diapers, I can call up a number and it'll come to me, you know, never mind that even the cartons in which we're depositing these things are depleting the forests that we want for climate change and causing trash to pile up in cities such that municipal organizations are being overloaded with the footprints of these activities. Why are we not regulating the footprints, for instance? Why are we only focusing on the information? We can think in environmental terms about cradle-to-grave legislation and litigation. Why don't we go after Amazon on some of these more circuitous channels, even if we can't regulate the direct activity in some sense? So it's the imagination that needs to be opened up, and I don't know quite how to do it. Certainly I can't do it alone, but we have to break down our earlier categories and reimagine the future of the world in different ways.
Well, thank you. Before moving to the audience, I still have a follow-up question. You mentioned the robber barons, and the robber barons you mentioned the robber barons. The robber barons were limited eventually in the power through the emergence of the trade unions, because the individual worker was obviously powerless, but you had the aggregation of power through trade unions. So the issue was translated into institutional channels. Can we identify today similar institutional channels that will make it possible for the individual who sits in front of his computer or his smartphone to coalesce with people like him and create political power or social power as a countervailing power to the power of those huge mammoths.
Well, it's interesting that you say this at a moment when my graduate students are striking against my university, and the people who are caught in the middle are the professors and the students, because the graduate students normally help the professors by doing the grading, and since they're not doing the grading, the professors are having to grade so that the students get grades, and in the meantime, Harvard is talking to the graduate students, and nobody's happy. So, you know, the only alternative is for us all to go on strike, including the students, and then that would be a different world. But you may know that there have been more strikes in the recent past in America than, I mean, so something about the union movement, it may not be quite dead in spite of the recent UK election results. But I think, again, part of the answer is, you know, why unionization and what was it that people came to think about labor? So when we give over our data to, say, genetic testing companies, because we like the thrill of being told we're X% Ashkenazi Jew and Y% South Asian or whatever, we are not paying attention to the fact that the companies are collecting those data and making a secondary business out of them. I mean, it really was not considered. I mean, it is remarkable that it was not considered, even though people who follow the technology were talking about this from very early times. So are we laboring for them when we provide the data? Are royalties the right sort of way to think about what should happen to us? I mean, you know, the nature, I mean, you mentioned subjects. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. We are being subjectified by these new technologies in a lot of ways without the benefit of any kind of legal order, forget constitutional, that says what is the responsibility of the new sovereigns in relation to these subjects. And I think we have to start thinking about that. So maybe labor unions are not the thing. Maybe it's going to be a much more individualized contract. But at the very least, if somebody is going to have the benefit of using my data over and over again, partly to target me, I mean, even that is a privacy thing. I mean, it's not a third party who gets my data. I don't want Amazon to be following me around the world and know exactly what I'm doing. And if they want to do that, they need to tell me more. They need to pay me more. They need to, I mean, you know, if somebody was stalking you, you would have recourse. So why should Jeff Bezos be allowed to stalk me and I do not have recourse? I mean, you know, these are things that so that may not be capturable in that form of solidarity that we used to consider old left and right. But there is surely the fact that we have all become consumers before citizens is a major change in the world. And we need to think of the consumer relationship with more protections attached to it, because consumers are being subjects at the same time. So the very nature of citizenship vis-a-vis the public-private boundary is being altered in ways that we need to understand more deeply and take up cudgels about and reorganize about in some way.
Final remarks of this thoughtful conference. We had, I think, serious deliberation about many problems regarding the challenges that we are facing. We talked about economic gaps, cultural gaps, lack of solidarity, problems with regard to the relations between our ruling authorities. We talked about the tension between religion and liberal democracy, about social media, globalization, cultural, economic gaps. Of course, as you said, Sheila, one academy cannot cope with all these problems. I'm not sure that all the academies together can do it. But I think that this conference gave us an opportunity to think together and to have an impact as scholars. Each of you might dedicate a paper about one of the subjects that he or she focused on. And I think that we, as Academy, we should compile all the material, all the lectures into a booklet comprised of a summary, no more than 1 page of each of the lectures that was delivered here, and with some of the recommendations, if we have, and we'll present it in our website. Thank you very much, all the participants and all the chairs, for 2 insightful days of deliberation. I have to thank in particular Shlomo. Shlomo was actually the one behind the idea of the conference and the one who actually thoughtfully planned it. So thank you very much. And deep gratitude to the Academy staff. First of all, Sima. Sima organized it all. Thank you for your excellent job. And Ziva, and Yaakov, and Kochi, and Michal, and Michael, and Galia, and, well, I thank you all again, who have a standing invitation to visit our Academy, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.